The plantation rose from the flats of the earth like a monument to control, its wide porch wrapped around the house in clean white symmetry, overlooking cotton fields that stretched endlessly beneath the humid sky. To passing travelers it looked peaceful, prosperous, almost noble. The owner was known in town as a reserved and disciplined man, a widower who rarely spoke of his personal life. His wealth was visible in every polished surface and carefully tended acre, yet his household remained strangely quiet. After his wife's death, many expected him to remarry quickly for stability. Instead, he withdrew deeper into himself and into the boundaries of his estate. Within months of the funeral, a decision was made that puzzled both house servants and field workers. One enslaved man was removed from field labor and assigned an unusual role inside the main house. He was instructed to care for the master's 2 young children full-time. The explanation given was practical. The children needed stability. The father was too occupied with business matters. Yet the choice unsettled many. There were experienced housemaids and elderly servants who had raised white children before. Still, the master insisted on this particular man. The enslaved man had a reputation for calm strength. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He observed everything. Years of labor had hardened his body, but his eyes carried a thoughtful awareness that others quietly respected. When he was summoned to the main house and informed of his new duties, he understood he had no power to refuse. He would move into quarters closer to the mansion. He would attend to the children's meals, their studies, their daily routines. He would answer only to the master. At first the children were restless and grieving. Their mother's absence left long silent spaces in the hallways. They woke at night calling for someone who would never return. The enslaved man responded patiently, carrying lantern light through dark corridors, sitting beside their beds until their breathing slowed. He told them simple stories in a steady voice. He showed them how to tie ribbons and lace shoes. Slowly they began to cling to him as their constant presence. The master observed from a distance. He would stand in the doorway during reading lessons, watching quietly as the children leaned closer to the man teaching them letters by candlelight. His face revealed little, but his jaw often tightened. He did not interfere. Instead, he allowed the arrangement to deepen. Days turned into seasons, and the enslaved man became more than caretaker. He became tutor, protector, and silent guardian of their emotional world. Whispers began among the servants. They noticed small details others might dismiss. The curve of the boy's cheek seemed familiar. The girl's smile mirrored something not easily explained. No one dared speak openly. In a place ruled by fear and hierarchy, questions could be dangerous. Still, resemblance is difficult to ignore when seen daily. The children grew taller, stronger, and with growth came features that stirred quiet speculation. The master responded to no rumors because none was spoken in his presence. Yet his behavior grew more controlled. He restricted access to the children. He shortened their visits to town. He discouraged interaction with neighboring families. Public appearances became rare. When they did attend church, the master kept them close at his side, as though proximity alone could contain something fragile. The enslaved man understood more than anyone realized. He recognized the way townspeople studied the children's faces. He saw the fleeting glances exchanged between servants. He felt the weight of an unspoken connection he was forbidden to acknowledge. Every act of kindness he offered carried risk. Every protective gesture tightened the invisible web around him. Years passed, and the children's bond with him deepened beyond what society would deem acceptable. They trusted him instinctively. They sought his advice before approaching their father. When frightened, they ran toward him. The master's authority remained absolute, yet emotionally he stood at a distance. That distance was filled by the man he owned. The plantation itself remained orderly, its fields producing abundant harvests. To outsiders, nothing appeared unusual, but inside the main house a silent tension thickened. The children began asking questions about their mother, about family lineage, about why they were not allowed to visit neighboring estates freely. The master's answers were brief and carefully shaped. The enslaved man remained quiet, knowing the truth could not protect him. As adolescence approached, resemblance became harder to dismiss. The boy's height mirrored that of the caretaker rather than the master. The girl's eyes carried a familiar depth that echoed across generations not publicly acknowledged. Servants exchanged glances more frequently. The overseer noticed but chose silence, understanding that knowledge can be fatal when misused. The master sensed the shift. He tightened his control further. He reassigned certain servants to distant tasks. He limited private conversations. He reminded everyone through subtle displays of discipline who held power. Yet beneath that authority lingered fear. Not fear of rebellion, but fear of revelation. The enslaved man carried his burden without outward change. He continued teaching, guiding, protecting, but in quiet moments alone he allowed himself to consider the future. The children were growing into awareness. Sooner or later they would question the boundaries drawn around them, and when that day came, the truth would not remain contained within white columns and locked study doors. The foundation of the plantation rested on ownership and silence. But silence has limits. The longer the arrangement endured, the heavier it became. The master believed control could shape reality. He believed secrecy could erase resemblance. He believed authority could command perception. Yet blood and time have their own logic, and somewhere beyond the manicured gardens and disciplined fields, the first cracks in that carefully constructed world were beginning to form, unseen but inevitable. As the children entered adolescence, the atmosphere inside the plantation house shifted in ways that could not be corrected with discipline alone. The boy's voice deepened, steady and measured, carrying a tone that startled even himself when he heard it echo across the hallway. The girl grew taller, her posture confident, her gaze direct in a manner that unsettled visitors who were accustomed to carefully trained politeness. Their features, once soft and easily attributed to childhood uncertainty, sharpened into something unmistakable. Servants noticed first. They always did. The enslaved man continued his duties with the same controlled composure he had maintained for years. He supervised lessons, corrected handwriting, and guided the boy through arithmetic while teaching the girl to read complex passages without hesitation. His patience never faltered in public view, yet inside he understood that proximity was becoming dangerous. The children were no longer small enough for innocence to shield them. They asked sharper questions now. They noticed how their father avoided extended conversation. They observed how certain servants fell silent when they entered a room. One evening, the boy studied his reflection in a polished silver tray while preparing for supper. He tilted his head slightly, comparing his profile to that of his father, who stood across the room adjusting cufflinks. The resemblance was faint at best. Later that night, he found himself staring across the yard toward the quarters where the enslaved man slept. The distance felt shorter than it once had, as though an invisible thread connected the spaces. The girl, more observant than anyone realized, began to trace patterns. She noticed the way her caretaker's hands resembled her own, long fingers, steady movements, a particular curve at the knuckles. She tested similarities quietly, standing beside him while he poured water, comparing skin tones beneath filtered sunlight. She said nothing aloud, but awareness settled over her like a shadow that would not lift. The master sensed this growing curiosity. His demeanor hardened. He shortened lessons and insisted on taking a more visible role in his children's education, though his patience for such work was limited. His attempts felt forced, mechanical. The emotional bond he tried to project did not match the natural ease the children displayed with the enslaved man. Each interaction left him more frustrated than before. Rumors outside the plantation began to circulate more boldly. A neighboring estate hosted a small gathering one Sunday afternoon, and conversation drifted toward the peculiar closeness within the master's household. A guest remarked casually that the boy did not favor his father as much as expected. The comment was brief, but it carried weight. In communities where lineage defined identity, resemblance was rarely dismissed. When the master heard whispers of that remark days later, his reaction was swift and controlled. He restricted the children's visits beyond the estate entirely. Invitations were declined without explanation. Church attendance became irregular. Isolation, he believed, would protect what he had constructed. Inside the plantation, tension tightened further. The overseer received new instructions to monitor conversations among both house servants and field workers. Any suggestion of gossip was to be reported immediately. Fear settled heavily over the quarters. The enslaved man felt the shift most acutely. He noticed how eyes followed him now, not with camaraderie but with caution. Association with him had become risky. The boy eventually gathered the courage to ask a question that had been forming for months. One late afternoon, as they walked along the riverbank where lessons once felt safe and distant from scrutiny, he asked why people in town stared at him differently. The enslaved man paused before answering. He chose his words carefully, reminding the boy that curiosity often unsettles those who cannot explain what they see. It was not a full answer, but it was the safest one possible. The girl's questions were quieter but more direct. She asked about ancestry, about grandparents she had never met, about stories that felt incomplete. The master's responses were vague, redirecting conversation toward estate matters or future responsibilities. The absence of detail only deepened her suspicion. As harvest season approached, the plantation thrived materially, while its foundation weakened emotionally. The children's loyalty to their caretaker remained unwavering. When the boy fell ill with fever, it was the enslaved man who stayed by his bedside through the night, cooling his forehead and counting breaths. The master entered occasionally, standing stiffly at the doorway before retreating. The imbalance was visible to anyone who dared observe. In private, the master confronted the enslaved man without raising his voice. He reminded him of his position, of the consequences of overstepping boundaries. The words were measured but heavy with warning. The enslaved man listened in silence, offering no argument. He understood that survival required restraint, not defense. Yet restraint could not change biology. As the children matured further, the physical similarities grew undeniable. The boy's build matched that of the man who had once labored in the field. The girl's eyes reflected a depth and shape that mirrored his exactly. Servants began avoiding direct eye contact with all three of them when they stood in the same space. The turning point came unexpectedly during a rare church visit. Seated in a pew beneath stained glass, sunlight filtering across their faces, the congregation shifted restlessly. An elderly woman leaned toward her companion and whispered something too audible to ignore. The girl heard her name followed by a comparison that struck like thunder. The boy stiffened beside her. Across the aisle, the enslaved man lowered his gaze. The master felt every movement in that moment. His hands tightened around the edge of the pew. He did not look toward the whispering woman, but his composure fractured slightly. For the first time, he realized that containment was slipping beyond his control. After that day, questions were no longer internal. The children spoke to each other in hushed tones at night. They compared memories, examined features in mirrors, and recalled every warning their father had given without explanation. The possibility they once avoided began to feel real. Within the plantation walls, silence thickened to suffocation. The master doubled down on authority, increasing discipline among servants and reinforcing his dominance publicly. But power could not erase resemblance. It could not undo years of shared presence, shared lessons, shared affection. The enslaved man sensed the approaching collision. He understood that truth, once recognized by the children themselves, could not be forced back into silence. He had protected them for years. Now he faced a different question. How long could protection survive when awareness replaced innocence? And as autumn winds began to strip leaves from the trees lining the plantation drive, the carefully maintained order of the estate stood on the brink of unraveling. By the time winter settled over the plantation, the illusion of control had begun to fracture beyond repair. The air inside the house felt colder than the season demanded. Conversations stopped when doors opened. Footsteps echoed longer in the corridors, as though the walls themselves were listening. The children no longer accepted vague explanations. Awareness had rooted itself deeply within them, and it would not loosen its grip. The boy was the first to act. One evening, after weeks of silent observation, he entered his father's study without invitation. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting restless shadows across shelves of ledgers and polished wood. The master looked up slowly, surprised, but unwilling to show it. The boy stood straighter than ever before, no longer a child asking for comfort, but a young man demanding clarity. His question was simple. He asked why he looked more like the man who raised him than the man whose name he carried. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. The master's composure wavered in a way it never had publicly. He dismissed the resemblance as coincidence, as imagination shaped by proximity. He spoke of loyalty, of gratitude owed, of the dangers of careless thinking. But the explanation lacked conviction. The boy saw it in his father's eyes. The girl confronted the truth differently. She sought out the enslaved man in the early hours before sunrise, when the plantation still slept, and only faint grey light filtered across the yard. She did not accuse. She simply stood before him and asked whether there were things she had not been told. The question carried no anger, only quiet determination. The man who had protected her since infancy felt the weight of years pressing against his chest. He knew that any answer could destroy the fragile balance that kept them all alive. He told her that the world they lived in was built on ownership and silence, and that sometimes silence was chosen not to deceive but to survive. It was not confession, yet it was more truth than she had ever been given. In his hesitation, she found confirmation. Within days, the siblings shared their suspicions openly with one another. They examined family records stored in the study, tracing dates and absences. They noticed inconsistencies around the time of their mother's illness. They counted months carefully. The arithmetic unsettled them. The story they had accepted for years no longer aligned with evidence hidden in plain sight. Servants sensed the shift immediately. The children's demeanor changed. They no longer lowered their voices when passing through hallways. They no longer avoided certain topics. A tension pulsed between the master and his heirs that could not be disguised as ordinary conflict. The overseer reported subtle changes in routine, conversations overheard but not fully understood. The plantation felt like a structure with hairline cracks spreading silently beneath its surface. The master reacted as he always had when threatened. He tightened control. The enslaved man was reassigned briefly to field supervision under the pretense of seasonal necessity. The separation was abrupt and deliberate. The children protested, especially the girl, whose composure fractured for the first time. The master responded with stern authority, reminding them of their place, of expectations tied to their name. But distance only clarified what proximity it concealed. From across the yard, the boy studied the enslaved man as he worked among the cotton rows. Their movements mirrored each other unconsciously, the same stride, the same tilt of the head when listening. Even posture revealed similarity. It was no longer resemblance alone, it was recognition. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly during a violent winter storm. Wind battered the plantation house, rattling shutters and tearing branches from trees. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the yard in harsh flashes. In the chaos, part of the stable roof collapsed, trapping several workers beneath debris. Without hesitation, the enslaved man rushed forward to pull them free. The boy followed, ignoring his father's shouted command to remain inside. In the midst of rain and splintered wood, the two worked side by side, lifting beams with identical strength and instinctive coordination. When the danger passed, they stood soaked and breathless beneath the storm. The overseer stared at them, his expression no longer confused but certain. Similarity was no longer rumor, it was undeniable. The master witnessed the scene from the porch. For the first time, fear overpowered authority. He saw in that shared effort something he could not command away. Blood recognizes blood, even when denied. In the days following the storm, whispers spread beyond the plantation boundaries. The overseer, unsettled by what he had seen, confided in a neighboring landowner. The story traveled quickly through quiet channels. Speculation sharpened into accusation. Questions that once lingered in shadows now moved into open conversation. The children confronted their father together. They no longer sought reassurance. They demanded truth. The master's voice remained firm, but his certainty had eroded. Years of carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of evidence and shared awareness. He realized that denial would no longer protect his reputation or his authority. In a final attempt to contain the unraveling, he made a decision born of desperation. He considered selling the enslaved man southward, far from the estate, where distance could silence suspicion permanently. The plan was discussed in hushed tones with the trader passing through town. The transaction would be discreet, the separation irreversible. But secrets rarely cooperate with urgency. Word of the potential sale reached the children before arrangements were complete. The girl overheard fragments of conversation outside the study door. The boy confirmed it by confronting the overseer directly. Panic replaced confusion. They understood that removal was not merely punishment, it was erasure. That night, for the first time in their lives, the children defied their father openly. They declared that if the enslaved man was sold, they would leave the plantation as well. They would expose every inconsistency in public. They would force explanation before the town that already whispered. The threat was not childish rebellion. It was calculated. The master stood at the center of a collapsing world. His authority depended on perception. His wealth depended on stability. His name depended on lineage. The very children he sought to protect from scandal had become the agents of potential exposure. Outside, winter clouds drifted slowly across a pale sky, indifferent to human secrecy. The plantation fields lay dormant beneath frost, waiting for spring's inevitable thaw. Inside the mansion, truth pressed harder against walls built to contain it. And for the first time since the arrangement began, the enslaved man realized that the truth might not destroy only him. It might destroy everything the master had spent a lifetime building. The days that followed felt unnaturally still, as though the plantation itself were waiting for judgment. No decision was announced, yet everyone sensed that something irreversible hovered in the air. The trader who had quietly discussed purchasing the enslaved man did not return. The master remained inside his study for long stretches, emerging only to issue brief instructions that carried none of his former certainty. His authority, once effortless, now required visible effort. The children moved through the house differently. They no longer avoided their father's gaze. When they entered a room, they carried themselves with quiet resolve rather than confusion. The threat they had made was not repeated, but it lingered between them like a contract sealed without ink. The master understood that forcing the sale now would ignite exactly the public scrutiny he feared. In town, speculation intensified. The overseer's loose words had multiplied into layered rumors. Some claimed the resemblance between the boy and the enslaved man was impossible to ignore. Others whispered about the years following the mistress's death, about the strange closeness that had drawn comment even then. No one possessed proof, but proof was becoming unnecessary. Suspicion alone could stain a family name. One afternoon, a local attorney arrived at the plantation under the pretense of reviewing property records. He had long served as the master's legal advisor, managing contracts and land transfers. This visit carried a different weight. The conversation inside the study extended for hours. Papers were unfolded, examined, and folded again. Voices rose once, then fell into controlled murmurs. Outside the closed door, the children waited in tense silence. The enslaved man continued his assigned tasks in the fields, though his reassignment now appeared symbolic rather than practical. Workers studied him with new understanding. Some offered subtle nods of solidarity. Others kept their distance, fearful that proximity to scandal might bring punishment. He carried himself as he always had, steady and composed. Yet he felt the shift in atmosphere as clearly as approaching rain. When the attorney departed, the master called his children into the study. The fire burned brightly despite the mild afternoon, casting sharp light across the room. He spoke carefully, explaining that malicious gossip had grown dangerous. He insisted that unity within the household was essential. He did not confess. He did not deny. Instead, he offered a version of events crafted to preserve order. He described grief, loneliness, and reliance on a trusted servant during a vulnerable period. He framed the situation as one of emotional dependency rather than betrayal. The children listened without interruption. They heard what he avoided saying more clearly than what he voiced. Silence followed his explanation, heavy and unmistakable. It was the girl who finally responded. She asked whether truth mattered less than reputation. The question hung between them, impossible to dismiss. Outside the mansion walls, the plantation's workers exchanged fragments of information like currency. News traveled beyond the estate boundaries. A visiting preacher mentioned from the pulpit the importance of moral integrity within powerful households. Though no names were spoken, every listener understood the implication. The master felt eyes upon him during that service more intensely than ever before. Pressure mounted from unexpected directions. A neighboring landowner who had long envied the plantation's prosperity began quietly encouraging investigation. He suggested that hidden scandal weakened the community's collective strength at a time when regional tensions were rising. Political uncertainty across the South made stability appear fragile. A family dispute now carried broader consequences. Faced with mounting scrutiny, the master realized that denial alone would not shield him indefinitely. He returned to the attorney with a proposal. Legal documentation would be prepared granting the enslaved man limited but significant protection from sale or transfer. Officially, it would appear as recognition of loyal service. Unofficially, it would prevent abrupt removal that might provoke public suspicion. The document stopped short of freedom, yet it acknowledged a bond deeper than ownership. When the paper was presented for signature, the enslaved man read it slowly, understanding both its generosity and its limits. It secured his presence on the estate, but did not restore his autonomy. It protected him from disappearance, but not from silence. He signed because survival required compromise. The children interpreted the gesture differently. To them, it was confirmation that their father feared exposure. It proved that truth held power even when unspoken. Their relationship with him shifted permanently. Respect remained outwardly intact, yet trust fractured beyond repair. Weeks later, an unexpected event forced the issue further into daylight. A distant relative of the deceased mistress arrived unannounced, claiming interest in family inheritance. During dinner, under flickering candlelight, he remarked openly on the boy's striking resemblance to someone he could not immediately place. The room fell silent. No one answered. The observation lingered like smoke. The relative's visit extended for several uncomfortable days. His questions grew sharper. He requested to review older correspondence and household records. The master's patience thinned. The children watched carefully, aware that the balance teetered closer to collapse with each inquiry. Finally, in a private confrontation behind locked doors, the relative accused the master of deception. He suggested that the legitimacy of the heirs might be contested if rumors solidified into testimony. The threat was unmistakable. Reputation was no longer the only risk. Inheritance itself stood vulnerable. That night, after the relative departed abruptly, the master faced a reality he had spent years avoiding. Silence could no longer guarantee control. The truth had grown visible in faces, in posture, in shared instinct. It had traveled beyond plantation gates and taken root in other minds. He summoned the enslaved man to the study for the first time in weeks. No witnesses were present. The conversation that followed was quiet but transformative. The master acknowledged that the children's questions would not disappear. He admitted that concealment had failed, yet even then he stopped short of full confession. Pride and fear battled within him. Outside, spring began to touch the fields again. Cotton seedlings pressed upward through soil that had endured frost. Change moved slowly but inevitably across the land. Within the plantation house, the same process unfolded. Truth had not yet been declared publicly, but it stood at the threshold, waiting only for a final push. The fourth chapter of their story was not defined by dramatic revelation, but by erosion. Authority weakened under scrutiny. Silence lost its strength. The children stepped closer to independence, and the man who had been forced to raise them understood that whatever happened next would reshape all their lives in ways none of them could fully control.